There's a moment that sneaks up on you. It doesn't announce itself, it doesn't arrive with fireworks or some grand revelation. It's quieter than that, more profound. It's the moment when you begin to see things not as they're presented, but how they actually are. And more often than not, that shift comes with the raising of your intellect. It's not just intelligence in the conventional sense, not test scores, not trivia, not memorization. I'm talking about a deeper, more deliberate way of thinking. The kind that questions, dissects, and reflects. The kind that refuses to accept the easiest answers. When intellect begins to shape your perspective, life, it doesn't look different, it feels different. Let's talk about how that transformation unfolds. At first, nothing seems unusual. You're still living your life, going through your routines, responding to the same stimuli. But gradually, your mind, it starts asking questions that it's never asked before. Why do people believe what they believe? Why do systems exist the way that they do? Why does the world feel so structured, yet so chaotic? This is where philosophy enters the room. You have to think about the ancient thinkers, not as relics of history, but as your companions in your mental evolution. They weren't concerned with the surface level answers, they dug deeper. Socrates questioned everything, not to destroy ideas, but to refine them. Aristotle, he tried to make sense of existence itself, and the Stoic philosophers, they explored control, what's within your power and what isn't. What you begin to notice is this: intellect, it doesn't hand you certainty, but it gives you better questions. And once those questions take root, you can't unsee the cracks in what you once accepted as solid truth. One of the first major shifts is learning to recognize the motivations, especially in large-scale events. Before, global news, it might have seemed like a sequence of disconnected incidents. Conflicts, policies, economic changes, just a bunch of things happening. But intellect, it starts connecting the dots. You begin to notice patterns, power dynamics, incentives, and hidden agendas. It becomes harder to accept narratives at their face value. Not because you've become cynical, but because you're aware that every story has layers. Why does a nation act a certain way? Why do leaders make particular decisions? And why do media outlets frame information differently? These questions don't always have clear answers, but asking them, it changes how you engage with reality. You stop reacting automatically. You start analyzing instead. And that creates distance. Distance from manipulation, from oversimplification, and from emotional bait. Because it's not about rejecting everything, it's about seeing the man behind the curtain. And with that awareness comes something more uncomfortable. You start questioning the corruption that's in structures that once felt unquestionable. Religion, politics, economics, social hierarchies. That doesn't mean that they're inherently meaningless, but they are, at their core, still constructed systems. They were frameworks designed by humans, shaped by history, and maintained by collective belief. And intellect, it doesn't necessarily tell you to abandon them, but it does force you to examine them. Why does this system exist? Who benefits from it? And what assumptions is it built on? And perhaps the most unsettling question of all, would this still hold power if people stopped believing in it? This realization can feel destabilizing. Because when you see structures as constructs, they lose some of their authority. They stop feeling so absolute. And that leaves you in a strange place. Freer, but also more responsible. You can't rely on inherited truths anymore. You have to build your own understanding. Another shift happens almost quietly. Your relationship with time changes. You start thinking beyond the immediate, beyond next week, next year. You start considering the long-term consequences. And not just for yourself, but for society, for future generations, and for the trajectory of mankind as a whole. And this isn't anxiety, it's perspective. You begin to see how small actions ripple outward, how decisions compound, and how short-term thinking often leads to long-term problems. And so, your priorities evolve. You become more deliberate, more patient, more willing to sacrifice immediate comfort for future clarity. It's not about becoming rigid, it's about becoming aware of scale. But here's where things take an unexpected turn. You might think that increased intellect would make someone colder, more detached, more analytical. But often, the opposite happens. You become more empathetic. But why? Because understanding complexity leads to compassion. When you see how beliefs are shaped by upbringing, culture, environment, it becomes harder to judge people simplistically. You start recognizing that most individuals aren't acting out of pure malice. They're navigating their own frameworks, their own limitations, and their own narratives. That doesn't excuse harmful behavior by any means, but it does contextualize it. And context creates space for empathy. You begin to listen more and react less. You realize that everyone is, in some sense, trying to make sense of existence, just like you are. And that shared struggle, it creates a subtle connection. Now here's something that might seem counterintuitive. As intellect deepens and illusions fall away, life doesn't necessarily become darker. In many cases, it becomes more positive. Not in a naive, overly optimistic way, but in a grounded, almost quiet appreciation. Why? Because when you strip away false expectations, and when you start seeing life for what it really is, not what you were told it should be, well, there's something strangely liberating about that. You're no longer chasing predefined milestones. You're no longer measuring your worth against arbitrary standards. Instead, you begin to value the experience itself. The little moments, the conversations, the thoughts, even uncertainty, it becomes something that you can sit with, rather than avoid. Life isn't perfect, but it's real. And that reality, it carries its own kind of beauty to it. As your perspective shifts, other feelings begin to change. You feel more connected, not in a mystical sense, though it can feel that way sometimes, but in a deeply rational, almost undeniable way. You start seeing patterns everywhere, in nature, in human behavior, in history, and you realize that everything is, in some way, linked. Actions influence outcomes, ideas spread and evolve, small changes cascade into larger ones, and suddenly, the boundary between yourself and the world, it feels less rigid. It turns out you're not separate from the system. You're a part of it. Your thoughts, your choices, your interactions, they all contribute to something larger. And this realization, it doesn't diminish individuality. It enriches it, because it places your existence within a broader context. But of course, this shift isn't without its challenges. Seeing more means carrying more, and you can't easily return to a place of ignorance. You can't unsee the patterns, the contradictions, the underlying struggles. Sometimes, that can feel isolating. There's also the risk of overanalysis, of getting stuck in thought loops, of trying to dissect everything instead of simply experiencing it. And this is where balance becomes essential. Intellect, it isn't about replacing life with analysis. It's about enhancing understanding while still allowing room for presence. And once the illusions fade, a question inevitably arises. What now? If traditional structures lose their authority, and if inherited beliefs no longer hold the same weight, then where does meaning come from? And this is where intellect turns inward. You start constructing your own framework, not based on blind acceptance or faith, but on deliberate reflection. What do you value? What matters to you? What kind of life feels authentic to you? These aren't questions with universal answers, and that's the point. Meaning becomes personal, flexible, ever-evolving. You're no longer confined to a predefined path. You're creating your own. And in the end, intellect, it doesn't give you all the answers. It doesn't solve every problem, and it doesn't eliminate uncertainty. But what it does change is how you relate to those things. You become more comfortable with ambiguity, more resilient in the face of complexity, and more thoughtful in your actions. You see through illusions, not to reject everything, but to engage with reality more honestly. And perhaps most importantly, you begin to live with intention. Not because someone told you how to live, but because you've taken the time to understand why you're living. So, how does intellect change your perspective on life? It sharpens your vision, it deepens your understanding, and it dissolves illusions while revealing connections. It can challenge you, unsettle you, but it refines you. And somewhere along the way, it gives you something unexpected. A clearer, more grounded appreciation for existence itself. Not because life becomes easier, but because you finally start seeing it as it truly is. And that, in its own way, is enough. Thank you for making it to the end of this video. So tell me, what are some things that you've noticed that you feel like other people aren't talking about enough? Or, if you have ideas for videos that you want to see in the future, drop them down below. We may just talk about it. Peace.